You've seen the shows, the horned helmets, the muscular warriors rowing dragon ships into the mist, the mead halls full of laughter and boasting. Forget almost all of it, because the real Viking world, the one that existed between roughly 793 and 1066 AD, was colder, crueler, and stranger than anything Hollywood has shown you. It was a world where a single bad harvest meant your children starved, where a careless insult could get you legally killed, where a punishment existed so horrifying that historians still argue about whether human beings could have actually survived it long enough for it to matter. Today, we're not doing the sanitized version. We're going into the freezing dark of a real Norse winter, into the legal system that decided who got to live like a person and who didn't, and, later in this video, into one of the most disputed and disturbing execution rituals in recorded history, the Blood Eagle. By the end of this, you'll understand why archaeologists studying Viking Age skeletons keep finding the same story written in bone, a life of constant, grinding risk. And stick around, because near the end, I'm going to tell you about the one Norse custom that modern historians find more disturbing than actual battle, something so normalized in Viking society that nobody at the time thought to write it down as unusual. That's coming up. Let's start with the thing that killed more Vikings than any sword ever did: the winter. Picture this. It's late October in Trøndelag, Norway, 850 AD. The sun is already setting by 4 p.m. In 6 weeks, it won't rise much above the horizon at all. Temperatures outside a longhouse are dropping toward -15 degrees Celsius, sometimes colder. Inside, 20 to 30 people, an entire extended household, along with a few unlucky farm animals brought in for warmth, are about to spend the next 5 months together in a single smoky room. This is not cozy. This is survival math. The longhouse wasn't a home. It was a life support system. A typical Viking longhouse was built from turf, timber, and stone, with walls sometimes over a meter thick, just to hold heat in. There was one long central hearth, no chimney, just a hole in the roof that let out maybe half the smoke, if you were lucky. Everyone inside breathed that smoke, all day, every day, for months. Modern researchers examining Norse-era skeletal remains have found lung damage consistent with what we'd expect from lifelong smokers. Except these people never touched a cigarette in their lives. Their lungs were cooked by their own homes. And here's the detail that should really unsettle you. Livestock lived inside too. Cows, pigs, and goats were often kept in an attached byre, sometimes separated from the human living space by nothing more than a low wooden partition. Why? Because the animal's body heat was a survival resource. You didn't keep them close because you liked them. You kept them close because their metabolism was the only heating system you had that didn't require chopping more wood. Coming up, I'll tell you what happened when that firewood ran out early, and the answer isn't what you'd expect. Starvation wasn't rare. It was expected. Here's something most documentaries skip entirely. Norse farmers didn't just worry about winter. They planned around the assumption that some winters would kill people. The Old Norse word fimbulvetur, the legendary Great Winter that precedes the apocalypse in Norse mythology, wasn't a fantasy invented for entertainment. It was a cultural memory. Ice core and tree ring data show that a real, catastrophic multi-year cooling event struck Scandinavia around 536 AD, likely triggered by volcanic eruptions, and it devastated harvests for years. Some archaeologists believe entire settlements were abandoned. The myth of the endless killing winter existed because the Norse had lived through something close to it. Even in a normal year, Norse farmers practiced what's grimly called culling every autumn, slaughtering a portion of their livestock not because they wanted to, but because there wasn't enough stored fodder to keep every animal alive until spring. Animals literally had their lives rationed, based on a spreadsheet of survival math, and when the humans' own food stores ran short, which they frequently did in the hunger gap of late winter/early spring, people ate bark bread, ground tree bark mixed with what little grain remained, baked into something that could technically be called bread, purely to stretch calories and trick a starving stomach into feeling fuller. Archaeobotanists have found traces of it in excavated ovens across Scandinavia. This wasn't a delicacy. This was the taste of a village trying not to die. Disease didn't wait for spring. Crammed together in smoke-filled longhouses, malnourished by February, and drinking water that was often contaminated by nearby livestock waste. Norse winters were also prime breeding conditions for illness. Skeletal analysis from Viking Age burial sites shows evidence of tuberculosis, chronic parasitic infections, and severe vitamin deficiencies, including scurvy-like symptoms, from months without fresh produce. Children's bones especially tell a brutal story. A shockingly high number of juvenile skeletons from this era show growth arrest lines, essentially scars in the bone that formed during periods of severe malnutrition or illness, then healed once the person had access to food again. Read one skeleton and you're reading a timeline of a body that nearly died, multiple times, before it was even fully grown. So if you were magically transported into a Viking village tonight in the dead of winter, here's your realistic itinerary. You'd be sleeping in a smoke-choked room next to livestock, eating bark bread by February, and hoping you didn't catch whatever illness was working its way through the household. And that's assuming you were even considered a full member of that household. Because up next, we're getting into something even darker than the winter. Who actually counted as a person in Viking society, and who very much did not? That answer is going to disturb you more than the cold ever could. Popular culture loves to paint Viking society as some kind of rugged proto-democracy. Free warriors, equal voices, a council of equals voting at the thing, their assembly. And there's a kernel of truth in that. If you happen to be born into the right third of the population, Norse society was legally and rigidly divided into three broad tiers, and which one you were born into or captured into determined almost everything about whether you lived a human life or something closer to livestock status. At the very bottom were the Thralls, enslaved people, and Viking Age slavery wasn't a minor institution. Historians estimate that in some regions, Thralls may have made up as much as 10 to 25% of the population. Many were captured during raids across the British Isles, Ireland, and Eastern Europe. In fact, the word slave in English ultimately derives from Slav, a grim linguistic fossil of just how many enslaved people in early medieval Europe were taken from Slavic territories. Thralls had essentially no legal personhood. Norse law codes, like the later Icelandic Gragas, treat the killing of a thrall as property damage, not murder. You paid a fine to the owner, not a penalty for taking a life. Thralls could be bought, sold, gifted, and, this is the detail that stops people cold, in some documented burial practices, killed to accompany their owner into the afterlife. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveler who documented a Viking funeral on the Volga River in 921 to 922 AD, described witnessing the ritual killing of an enslaved girl who had, according to his account, volunteered to die and join her deceased master. Whether that consent was real, coerced, drugged, or entirely absent is something historians still debate fiercely, and we genuinely don't know how representative this single, foreign observer account was of typical Norse practice. But even taking it as one documented data point, it tells you everything about where Thralls sat in the moral universe of Viking society. Replaceable, disposable, and property even in death. Above Thralls were the Karls, free farmers, craftspeople, and traders who made up the bulk of Norse society. Karls had legal rights, could own land, could speak at the thing, and could seek justice through the legal system. But legal rights in Viking society meant something very different from what we imagine today. Justice wasn't handed down by judges and police. It was largely a private, violent responsibility. If someone wronged you or your family, the expectation was that you handled it yourself, often through a blood feud. Iceland's medieval sagas are essentially wall-to-wall chronicles of these feuds spiraling for generations. A single insult or theft escalating into a cycle of retaliatory killings that could consume entire families for decades. And here's a detail that surprises people. Even for Karls, the punishment for serious crimes wasn't prison, it was outlawry. Being declared skogangsmaður, a full outlaw, meant you lost all legal protection. Anyone could kill you, take your property, and face zero legal consequence for it. You weren't executed by the state. You were simply removed from the protection of society and left to whatever happened next. Most full outlaws didn't survive long. At the top sat the Jarls, the aristocratic elite, chieftains and their families, who controlled land, warriors, and wealth. Status among Jarls wasn't just about birth, though that mattered enormously. It was reinforced constantly through displayed generosity, giving feasts, gifting weapons and jewelry, and displayed violence, successful raiding, feuds won, battles survived. A Jarl's entire social position depended on a public performance of dominance that never really stopped. And this is where the hierarchy gets genuinely disturbing by modern standards. Your value as a human being, under Norse law, was, quite literally, priced. This was called your Wergild, your man price. Norse and broader Germanic legal codes assigned a specific compensation value to a person's life, and that value changed drastically depending on your social rank. Killing a Jarl might cost you an enormous fortune in compensation. Killing a Thrall might cost you the same as replacing a decent cow. Let that sit for a second. An entire legal system, functioning smoothly for centuries, built on the explicit written premise that some human lives were worth vastly more than others, not morally, but in actual currency, calculated and enforced by law. Now, I promised you the details on the single most disputed and gruesome piece of Norse history, the Blood Eagle. What it supposedly was, whether it actually happened the way legend claims, and why some historians think the whole thing might be a horror story invented generations after the Viking Age ended. That's next. And it's more complicated, and in some ways more disturbing, than you've probably heard. Okay, let's talk about the ritual that has launched 1,000 thumbnails, 1,000 "you won't believe this" TikToks, and roughly zero historical consensus. Here's the popular version. A captured enemy, often a king or nobleman, is placed face down. His ribs are cut away from his spine, one by one, and pulled outward through his back like a pair of wings. Then, in the most extreme tellings, his lungs are pulled out through the wound and draped over his shoulders, still, supposedly, functioning, so that the dying man appears to be an eagle spread in flight, while, according to legend, he was still alive to feel it happen. It's one of the most stomach-turning images in all of medieval history. And I need to tell you honestly, historians are deeply divided on whether it ever happened at all, in that form, even once. The blood eagle appears in a small handful of Old Norse sources, and this is the detail that changes everything. None of them were written by eyewitnesses, and none of them were written anywhere close to when the events supposedly occurred. The most famous account involves King Ella of Northumbria, allegedly executed this way by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless among them, as revenge for Ella's execution of their father by throwing him into a pit of venomous snakes. This story appears in sources like Ragnar's Saga Lothbrokar and skaldic poetry, referencing the eagle being carved on a defeated enemy's back. But here's the problem. These sagas were written down in the 1200s and later, roughly 300 to 400 years after the events they describe supposedly took place. That's the equivalent of writing a historical account of the American Revolutionary War today, based purely on oral tradition, with zero contemporary documentation, and expecting every gory detail to be literally accurate. This is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because historians actively argue about this, and the disagreement itself tells you something important about how history gets constructed. One camp, including scholars like Roberta Frank, has argued the blood eagle may be a case of poetic misreading. Some of the earliest skaldic verses referencing an eagle carved into a victim's back may have originally been a metaphor, describing how a slain enemy's body was left for actual eagles and ravens to scavenge on a battlefield, a common and grimly poetic image in Norse war poetry. The theory goes that later saga writers, working centuries after the fact and less fluent in the exact idiom of earlier skaldic poetry, may have misread this poetic imagery and transformed a metaphor about carrion birds into a literal, gruesome execution ritual. Other historians push back on this and argue that ritualized brutal execution was well within the realm of possibility for the era, pointing to other well-documented Iron Age and early medieval practices of ritual killing, and noting that societies capable of documented practices like the bog body ritual killings in earlier Iron Age Scandinavia weren't strangers to elaborate, symbolic violence. So which is it? Honestly, we don't know for certain, and any documentary or video that tells you with total confidence this definitely happened exactly like this is oversimplifying a genuine, ongoing academic debate. Why the uncertainty doesn't make it less disturbing. Here's the thing though, and this is important. Even if the most extreme version of the blood eagle is partly or entirely a later literary invention, that doesn't actually make Viking Age violence less disturbing. It arguably makes it more revealing, because whether or not the blood eagle physically happened, the fact that Norse society could produce, circulate, and celebrate this story as an admirable act of vengeance tells you something real about their values. This wasn't a horror story meant to condemn its perpetrators. In the sagas, the sons of Ragnar are the heroes of the story. Extreme, symbolic, ritualized violence against an enemy, especially in the context of avenging a father, wasn't just tolerated in this culture. It was the kind of story worth telling for centuries, worth writing down, worth preserving as an example of honor fulfilled. Whether real or mythologized, the blood eagle exists at the exact intersection of two things we've already covered: a legal culture built on blood feud and violent retribution, and a social hierarchy where certain deaths were treated as spectacle and others were treated as bookkeeping. A conquered king's death became legend. A thrall's death was a line item. Now, I told you earlier there was a Norse practice that some historians find more disturbing than actual battlefield violence, purely because of how normal it was. It's coming up in the next section, along with a few other pieces of daily Viking life you have almost certainly never seen dramatized in any show or movie. This next section is, in some ways, the most unsettling part of this entire video, not because of gore, but because of how casually certain practices were woven into ordinary daily life. There's something deeply unnerving about violence and hardship that isn't treated as an event, but as Tuesday. Here's a practice that rarely makes it into Viking documentaries, likely because it's genuinely uncomfortable: the exposure of unwanted infants. In a subsistence society constantly balancing on the edge of famine, a newborn, particularly one born with visible disability, illness, or simply at a moment when a household couldn't support another mouth, could be left outside to die of exposure, a practice referenced in several Norse legal texts and sagas. This wasn't murder under Norse law. It was a decision made by the head of household, most often the father, and it was legally and socially sanctioned. Some historians argue this practice declined with the arrival of Christianity in Scandinavia around the 10th–11th centuries, as Christian doctrine explicitly condemned it. But for generations before that shift, it existed as a quiet, largely undiscussed mechanism for managing family size against brutal economic reality. There was no scandal attached to it in the way we'd expect today. It simply existed as an accepted, if grim, tool of survival. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about alliances and property. Here's another detail that clashes hard with the romanticized Viking narrative. Marriages, especially among Karls and Jarls, were overwhelmingly arranged and functioned as economic and political contracts between families, not romantic partnerships. A woman's marriage could be negotiated by her father or male guardian, and while Norse women actually had comparatively significant legal rights compared to many other medieval European societies, including the right to divorce, control of their own property, the dowry system worked differently and often favored women retaining assets, and the ability to run a farmstead independently while husbands were away raiding or trading. The initial marriage itself was rarely her choice. Sagas repeatedly describe marriages arranged purely to settle feuds, secure trade relationships, or merge land holdings. And in a detail that still catches people off guard, a wife's primary daily responsibility often included managing the household's keys, literally wearing a set of keys on her belt as a visible symbol of authority over the home stores. It sounds almost sweet until you realize what it actually represented: total responsibility for making food stores last an entire winter, with the well-being, or death by starvation, of the entire household resting partly on her rationing decisions. That's not a symbolic role. That's a life-or-death management job with zero margin for error. Even entertainment carried real physical risk. Norse society had a sport called nataleikr, a ball game referenced in several sagas, and while we don't have complete rules for it, surviving descriptions include injuries, broken bones, and at least one saga reference to a player being killed during a match, followed immediately by a blood feud in response, because in Viking society, it happened during a game wasn't automatically a legal excuse. An injury caused during sport could still trigger the exact same feud-based justice system as an injury caused in a genuine assault. The one practice some historians call more disturbing than war now, the detail I've been teasing throughout this video, the practice of senna and its escalation alongside the broader Norse concept of neith. Neith was a form of ritualized insult, accusing a man of cowardice, or worse, of taking a passive sexual role, was considered one of the deepest possible attacks on a man's honor in Norse society, far beyond a modern equivalent. This wasn't just rude language. Accusing someone of neith through a formal insult, or even through a carved wooden pole with an insulting inscription, called a neithstong, was considered legally actionable. Under some interpretations of Norse law, being the target of certain formal insults gave you the legal right to kill the person who said it, without facing the usual consequences of murder. Why do some historians find this more disturbing than battlefield violence? Because it means an entire society had normalized deadly violence as an appropriate, expected, legally supported response to words. Not to theft, not to physical assault, to language. A society that built legal exceptions for killing someone over an insult about their masculinity is a society where lethal violence wasn't reserved for extreme circumstances. It was baked into the texture of everyday social friction. Combine that with everything else we've covered, the Wergild pricing human worth by rank, the disposability of thralls, the legally sanctioned exposure of infants, the blood feuds spiraling across generations, and a picture emerges that's very different from the noble warrior culture aesthetic sold in modern media. It's a picture of a society running on a constant, low-grade hum of sanctioned violence, where the difference between an honorable act and a criminal one often came down entirely to your social rank and the circumstances, not the nature of the act itself. Let's bring this back to you, because that's really the question underneath this whole video. If you were dropped into a real Viking Age village tonight, here's your realistic checklist. You'd need to survive a smoke-filled longhouse shared with livestock without dying of lung disease. You'd need to make it through a winter where a bad harvest meant bark bread and rationed calories, and where children's bones bear permanent scars from malnutrition. You'd need to avoid contaminated water, parasitic infection, and diseases we can now cure with a course of antibiotics, but which routinely killed people in this era. You'd need to know your exact social rank instantly, because your legal worth, quite literally your price as a human being, depended on it. You'd need to navigate a culture where a poorly chosen insult could be legally answered with your death, and where family feuds could span generations and consume entire households. And if you were unlucky enough to be born a thrall, none of this would even be your choice to navigate. Your life would already belong to someone else. Real historians studying Viking Age remains consistently find a population that was, by modern standards, short-lived, disease-burdened, and constantly balancing on the edge of catastrophe. A population that nonetheless built ships that crossed oceans, founded settlements from Newfoundland to the Caspian Sea, and left behind sagas still being read, argued about, and adapted 1,000 years later. That contradiction, a society this brutal, producing achievements this remarkable, is, honestly, the real story of the Vikings. Not horned helmets, not simple savagery. A population making impossible choices, constantly, under conditions almost none of us could actually survive. So here's where it gets even more interesting, and honestly, even darker. Because everything we've covered today happened on land, in the mead hall, in the frozen dark of a longhouse in February. But there's a second side to Viking life we haven't even touched yet. What happened when these same people got into their ships and went raiding across the sea? And that story is, in some ways, more disturbing than anything in this video. Because the same legal system that priced human lives by rank at home is the exact system that turned entire coastal populations, monks, farmers, children, into commodities the moment a Viking raiding party dragged them onto a ship. We're talking about the real, documented mechanics of the Norse slave trade routes, stretching from Ireland to Byzantium and beyond. The terrifying reality of what a Viking raid actually looked like from the perspective of the people being raided, not the raiders, and one specific detail about how captives were transported and sold that has been almost completely left out of every popular Viking documentary you've ever seen. If this video showed you that surviving a Viking village was harder than you thought, the next one will show you that surviving a Viking raid was almost impossible, and I'll be breaking down exactly how those raids worked, minute by minute, in the next upload. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because that video is going up soon, and it picks up exactly where this one left off. If you want the full picture of Norse society, the brutal parts, the surprising parts, and the parts historians are still arguing about, go watch that next video now. It's linked right here, and trust me, it goes even further than this one did.